Welcome back, parents, to part 2 of how to talk to your child about race. I am Chantel Jordan, the school-based coordinator for Hilliard City Schools.
And I am Kelly Dainton, a school clinician for Hilliard City Schools.
So we both work for Syntero. We're a nonprofit counseling agency that provides mental health services. Our role in the schools specifically focuses on prevention and providing students tips and tools to manage different stressors or mental health needs.
Okay, so our goal for part 2 for caregivers and parents is to understand that we do have the ability to speak to our youth about race and race-related issues, and that doing so will positively impact our race, our youth, and our community.
So we're going to be talking about a few things today. Some of the things that we hope you gain from this presentation is learning age-appropriate conversations to have with your child about race, having helpful language when you are having those conversations, and the specific skills that we hope that you gain from this are how to finalize an action plan. So when you're ready to start those conversations with your youth, you have a plan. You can identify age-appropriate strategies, resources, books, media, all of these things that can help stimulate those conversations about race. And then finally, recognizing and utilizing skills to manage any personal discomfort you might have with having conversations about race.
Okay, so action planning. We will be discussing step 2 and step 3 today. Chantal went over this a little bit in part 1. But some questions you really need to be asking yourself before you engage in this conversation, again, are what else do I need to know about race before engaging in conversations with my youth? So what things are you not sure about, or are you unsure what you should say? We do have some resources we're going to share with you at the end, so that's a great tool that you can utilize before you have this conversation. So make sure that you're learning about different cultures, history, racial implications of things, privilege, and learn about some of the terminology that we did discuss in part 1, like implicit bias and discrimination, prejudice, and privilege. Those are all really important things to know about. Also ask yourself, what can my youth and I learn together about race? So maybe there are some things you'd rather learn together with your youth. Maybe things like history or prejudice, protests, and other discrimination, things that might elicit questions from your youth, and things you'd rather help kind of have a conversation with while you're engaging in it. So this would be a good way to kind of model that vulnerability and understanding and model the importance of learning about different cultures and races. And another thing to be thinking about is, what could my youth teach me about race and diversity? So our youth do understand a lot more than we may realize about race and racism. There is a lot of information shared on social media, and they may have already been exposed to these things. So being open to learning from them and their own perceptions and experiences can help further facilitate an understanding and empathy for other situations. So kind of when engaging and learning from your youth, you could utilize some open questions, like, what things could you share with me about your understanding of race and diversity? This can kind of open the conversation and help engage your youth in having that conversation. So how do we talk to youth about race? I am first going to share this really great quote. Dr. Aaron Winkler from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee says that parents need to know that it's okay not to know. Sometimes the best answer is, I'm not sure, but let's look into it and learn about it together. This is a great way to kind of model that vulnerability and that lack of understanding you may have and say, hey, it's okay, I don't know either, but let's figure this out together and learn together so we can both grow in our understanding.
Yes, I love that quote. Like Kelly was saying, it models that you can be thinking, be a critical thinker, educate yourselves together. So I love that. All right, so feeling prepared. So you really want to make sure that you're prepared to have these conversations. So don't just say, all right, tonight we're going to talk about race. You want to be prepared. So what you can do to prepare yourself is first educate yourself. Like Kelly mentioned, we've got lots of resources that we will share at the end, whether that's reading a book, reading a few articles, documentaries, all kinds of things that you can do to start the process of learning. Let go of perfectionism, basically saying the quote that Kelly mentioned earlier, you don't have to be the expert. This is really big. If we wait until we're experts, then we're not going to have the conversation. Kelly and I mentioned before in video 1, we're not the experts on how to talk to your kids about race. We're still learning. There's new research, there are new things coming out all of the time, and it's just about the willingness to grow and learn together. So let go of that perfectionism. Notice feelings. So this is also really important. If you notice yourself start to feel uncomfortable or sad or angry, pay attention to those feelings and then do what you need to do to calm down so that you can have a really insightful and helpful conversation with your youth. Also pay attention to maybe the why, explore that a little bit. What is it that's making you feel uncomfortable? And share that, talk about that, of why you felt upset and uncomfortable about it. And then finally, gathering resources. So it's kind of back up with educate yourself. But if you have the resources on hand, whether that's books, video clips, it can make things easier. And there are amazing teaching tools that can be opportunities to start that dialogue.
Okay, so we're going to talk about age-appropriate conversations and how you kind of engage in those things. So other minority groups and BIPOC, they're already having these conversations about race with their own young children and kind of what that means for them on a societal level. So young children do understand race and racial differences. So it's important to have these conversations with your own youth as well, even if they don't identify as being BIPOC or in a minority group. So kids will hear about race in their communities and they will have varying opinions and ideologies, they'll be ingesting those things based on other people and what other people say in their communities. So it's important to have these conversations with your youth just so that you can kind of instill your own moral values within them and that you can have these conversations in a safe environment. So it says they're not too young to talk about race. This is super cool. I love this infographic here, because this is something that I'm also learning about too. So it kind of discusses that from like birth until about 2 to 3 years old, that babies will start to recognize different races at 3 months old, which is super fascinating. Was not quite aware with that. And then they will have kind of more preference towards their caregiver's race. So these things are already things that babies and humans are developing as they just grow and change. And there's a quote down here that I really love. So young children do notice something about race, and adults often worry that talking about race will encourage racial bias in children, but that's actually the opposite. So silence about race reinforces racism by letting children draw their own conclusions based on what they see, kind of what they hear. So teachers and families can play a powerful role in helping children of all ages develop positive attitudes about race and diversity and skills to promote a more just future. So it's really interesting that even at birth to 3 months old, children are starting to kind of understand race. So it's really important to have these conversations. So when you do engage in these conversations, make sure that you keep developmental level in mind. So where they are in their developmental stages. Make sure you're using language, level, and tone that you would normally use when you're discussing with them at any age. We do have resources that even discuss talking with your youth about race in the preschool level. So there are ways that you can engage with very young children. And start by asking questions. Find out what they know, what they think, how they feel, and what they want to know. So when engaging in these conversations, it's important to understand where they're coming from, what they already understand, and maybe what they want to know and what they want to learn. And let them set the pace. They're ready for more when they ask questions. So if they start engaging in these conversations with you, maybe they're feeling really uncomfortable, it's good to kind of be aware of what your child is going through and what they want to know. And when they start engaging and asking more questions, that's when you're like, okay, we can kind of learn. That would be a great time to kind of model that. Hey, let's learn together. Let's have this conversation. Let's grow together if they ask you things that you're not sure of. And have ongoing conversations. One conversation won't and shouldn't be the end all be all. So only engaging in one conversation with your child isn't going to magically create this epiphany of enlightenment and racial justice within them. You have to have ongoing conversations that consist of growing knowledge. As Chantal said earlier, we're always hearing new research data, new things are popping up in our media and in our world on a consistent level. So have ongoing conversations and be comfortable to continue to engage, grow and learn.
So what do you say when you are ready to have these conversations? Well, starting with the basics, you can talk about what race is, what it isn't, letting your child know that it's okay. And furthermore, it's important to talk about differences, as long as we're careful not to make judgments based on those differences. So we talked about in the first video, bias versus discrimination. We all have biases about different cultures, different people, different things, and having conversations about that, it opens the door to really identify and evaluate some of those biases. But we just want to be careful not to make any stereotypes or judgments based on those differences. Also, talking about diversity in general, talking about its benefits. By talking about different cultures, it opens the door to celebrate those cultural differences. I know for some folks, we make the statement of, all cultures are important, all people matter, which is true, but then it doesn't really allow us to celebrate the nuances of everyone's culture. Black Americans specifically don't necessarily have a specific culture based on a country from Africa just due to slavery. We can't necessarily trace our background that far. So Black Americans have a specific culture, and being able to celebrate that. Culture is really just the pattern of learned and shared behaviors and experiences. And there is a very specific and unique experience that Black people in America have experienced. And so being able to being able to celebrate that particular culture and having those conversations, that's just one example of how you can talk about diversity and open that conversation. Also, talking about stereotypes, reminding youth that all people who share a specific identity aren't necessarily the same. All of their experiences aren't the same. They might be similar, but you have to be careful not to stereotype. So having those conversations about stereotypes can be really helpful in starting. Talking about fairness. If you have young children, preschoolers, they're able to very quickly say, hey, mom, dad, my caregiver, that's not fair. And so you can start to have those conversations about sometimes people are treated differently because of the color of their skin. For the younger ones, you don't necessarily have to get into the specific details, but just explaining, unfortunately, there are people who think less of certain people because of the color of their skin. Older children can have more deeper discussions about that. And you can talk about systemic racism and things that are happening in institutions or systems that continue to maintain this unfairness. And then finally, talking about actions. So what can you do to create change? Oftentimes our youth might feel disenfranchised or feel like they don't have a say to make change, but talking about what can you do as a youth, whether that's including kindness to everyone, listening to their friends, being an advocate, being an upstander when they see something or hear something that they don't agree with, encouraging them to speak up against that can be really helpful. So there are lots of things that our youth can do and that we can do as families. So talking about what you and your family would like to do to kind of help promote equity can be great ways to start the conversation of talking about race.
Okay, so here's some more what do I say? When it comes to violence, there is some police brutality and other violence that we are seeing in the media currently. And so we suggest avoid exposing youth to videos of violence against Black people and other people of color, but do talk about these events. So you don't necessarily have to share the graphic details and the videos of all the things that are kind of coming to light on social media that we're seeing. But it is important to still have these conversations and let your youth know that they are happening. Now, that might be something that's more appropriate for our older youth, as Chantel was saying. Really young children aren't necessarily need to be aware of the violence that's happening or the graphic violent videos that are happening and being posted in the world. So that's definitely something to be cognizant of, but it still is important, as she said, to talk about how some people are treated differently based off the color of their skin. And make sure when you do engage in talking about the violence that we're seeing to ask about their feelings and share the skills that you use to process these big feelings. This would be a good way to have some coping strategies and say, hey, here's how I kind of work through some of these big feelings, whether that's taking deep breaths, going on walks, journaling, talking to an adult or a loved one about the experiences that you might be going through. This is a great way to have engaged in that conversation with them about how they're feeling about the violence that they are hearing about and perhaps even seeing on social media. And make sure that you emphasize youth safety. Assure them that you are there to keep them safe and talk about why it isn't fair that some people are less safe because of their skin color. So sometimes seeing violent things or hearing about violence, it can be scary for youth, and that can make them start to worry about their own safety and their own worries in their own community. So assure them that with you that they are safe, and you want to make sure that they are in a safe space when they do engage in these conversations. Protests, that's another thing that's kind of going on right now in our society. And your youth may or may not be seeing them based on social media, or they may or may not be hearing them based on conversations that they might experience in the world. So discuss with them the meaning and purpose of protests. Review different types of protests and examples from history and current events. So protests have gone on throughout our history. So throughout the context of our country and the world, there have been many protests that have gone on for various reasons. And there are very different ways that you can protest. So make sure that you discuss with them the types of protests that they might see. It could be marches that we've been seeing, sit-ins, teach-ins, boycotting certain businesses, letter writing, calling senators, things like that are all ways to kind of protest. One that they might be seeing on social media is something called cancel culture. So it's kind of a protest where somebody, a business or an influencer or a celebrity or somebody does something that might not be the most sensitive to racial issues. And so then the social media will say cancel culture. So they'll say, stop associating with these people or stop associating with this business, or they're writing bad reviews. So those are some of the protesting that can be done on social media that your youth might already be seeing if they are engaged in social media. So it's important to have those conversations so they kind of understand what's going on. And again, emphasize youth safety. Protesting can seem overwhelming, seeing all these people together chanting. And sometimes there are some counter protesters and people don't believe the same things that the protesters do. And that can kind of seem scary. So make sure you tell your youth that, again, they are safe, they're safe with you, and they're safe to have these conversations with you. And talk about why working for change is hard and can take a long time. Acknowledge mistakes and acknowledge barriers, and that sometimes, even though there's protests going on for months and months and months, why it might be difficult to get change and why things take time and how other people might not believe the same things, just so they can kind of understand more why these protests are happening and what they mean.
Some additional tips for white families wanting to talk to their youth about race. One, explaining privilege. So focusing on it as an opportunity to educate and explain kind of what's going on as far as privilege goes. It's not a source of guilt or shame. It's also not to say that white people or people in the majority don't experience hardships. That's not what white privilege is talking about specifically. It's more so that it can be guaranteed that your hardship is not related to the color of your skin. And privilege isn't just white privilege. We talked in the first video, you can have privilege because you're a male. Lots of different of ways that you might have privilege. So focusing on it more as an opportunity and a responsibility to work towards change. But again, it's not a source of shame or guilt. It's something that's there, and we can educate ourselves and talk about it and use that as a sounding board to be able to make change. Also, teaching allyship is more about empathy and supporting a person of color rather than white saviorship. It's not your job to come in and save the day, but it's how do we work together to really be supportive and focusing on joy and contributions. That term BIPOC, just as a reminder, it just stands for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So it was an acronym that was adopted to address the specific inequities that have been faced by Black and Indigenous people in North America. So the BI, Black and Indigenous, is just another nuance to add to the term of people of color. We also want to teach respectful curiosity. It's great and it's important to want to learn, but we have to help our youth understand that their curiosity does not trump a person of color's privacy. So maybe they don't want to explain different things to you. And so we want to encourage our youth to ask questions in appropriate settings, encourage them to do research on their own rather than relying on their friends to teach them. You might have friends who are very open to answering questions and doing that, but we don't want to assume that everyone is. It can be very stressful and a bit of a burden to have to explain something all the time. And as we mentioned in the first video, a person of color is not the end-all be-all representative for all minorities. So they're only going to be able to speak to their specific experiences. So it's really important that we teach our youth to be respectful of that curiosity. How else can they learn? If they've got friends, like I said, that are open to talking about that, great, but let's just not assume that they are.
Okay, so action planning, step 3, we've made it to when will I start conversations with my youth about race? So there's 2 things that it can go. Mark your calendar for sure. When you want to discuss with your youth, put a date on the calendar. Say, today we're going to have this conversation, and let your child know that on that day you will be having this conversation. So that's like, maybe they could also plan if they have any questions or things that they would really like to learn or discuss. They could also plan ahead and say, hey, I saw this on social media, or hey, this happened in school, or hey, my friend said this, I have these questions. That gives them the opportunity to plan themselves in case they really want to have that conversation. And it also can relieve the anxiety. If you just kind of like bust out that conversation, maybe they won't be ready for it, and it will catch them off guard, or they won't know what's happening if you just mark the calendar, like, today we're going to have a conversation. So letting them know on this day we're going to talk about this and kind of ease the anxiety, and it can help them prepare and plan for the conversation that they are going to have with you. And on top of that, plan. So plan the conversation you want to have. I think it's really great to have a notebook or an agenda. So things that you'd like to discuss and how you'd like to discuss it. So planning out your notes can be a great way to have difficult conversations, and it can help kind of the flow of the conversation. And it also can make sure that you hit things that you really want to discuss with your youth. And this is also another opportunity to share with your youth, like, hey, you can also plan for this conversation. If you have things you would like to bring to me, feel free to write them down. Feel free to have your own agenda and your own items that you really would like to discuss. So even if they are feeling a little nervous about the conversation and the date of the conversation, let them know the importance of having this conversation. And it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to not understand everything. It's okay to learn together. And that it's important to have an open mind and to engage in these conversations, to become more equitable as a society, more empathetic as a society, more understanding and more just.
So we've been talking about additional resources. So we're going to talk about some of those resources now. So for adults, there's quite a few just resources out there, not just for adults, but in general. But these are just a few that we wanted to share. So some ones to highlight: How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi is a great one to start with. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, that explores the discomfort that occurs when white people talk about race. And it also explores just how these counterproductive reactions maintain racial inequality. If you're not into books and would prefer visual or documentaries, there's quite a few of those as well. 13th is a documentary on Netflix that explores the criminalization of African Americans and talks about the disproportionate population of Black people in prison. Other films, Just Mercy, it's on Prime Video, a couple other different things that you can take a look at for adults. If you have preschoolers, there are great children's books and television shows. So at this age, I think it's more about introducing your child to new cultures. Kelly mentioned before that, babies can start to recognize different races and they tend to have a preference towards the race of their caregiver, which makes sense. But if we can start introducing them to new cultures, and then you can start to have that conversation about those differences and then getting them curious about other people. Hair Love by Matthew A. Cherry is a great book about really just loving your natural hair and about father-daughter relationships. It's a great one. Television shows, Sesame Street, lots of different episodes on diversity, all kinds of diversity, not necessarily just race, but also, disabilities versus able-bodied folks, all kinds of episodes on diversity. Another one that's not mentioned here, Mira, the Royal Detectives on Disney Junior or Disney. And it's about, the main character is an Indian American girl who is a detective and she really enjoys solving mysteries. But that's a great one. My daughter loves that show. Mm-hmm. Doc McStuffins, all of these have the main characters are from different cultures. So starting those conversations early about people that look different than you can be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sesame Street also did have a special on racism and race in our country. So they're very diverse in general with the people that are engaged with that and the characters that they put on it. But they did have a special on that, which was really great. I also did watch that one with my 4-year-old, and they explain it in a really wonderful way. That's easier for the younger folk to understand. So it was really good.
Here are some elementary age resources. Again, looking at television shows with the main characters are of a different race or ethnicity. Books, Each Kindness by Jacqueline Woodson, Not My Idea, a book about whiteness by Anastasia Higginbotham. Lots of different resources there that you can read with your kids, watch together, and then have conversations about them. Middle school. So this is where you can really start to have more in-depth conversations about injustices that are happening in the world, having those critical conversations. And these are some great books that are for middle school, some fiction, and I believe some nonfiction in there as well. All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley. Jason Reynolds has a lot of books out there. Also different television shows. Andy Mack is on Disney. Basketball or Nothing on Netflix. And we will share these so that you have them. I know we're going through them kind of fast, but
I was like, quick, a screenshot.
Yes, we will share these with you. High school. I think even some of the television shows on high school could be appropriate for middle school as well, like Blackish, Mixedish. A lot of their episodes talk about different racial injustices that are happening in the world. There are specific episodes focused on it. But it's also just seeing families of a different race, a different world. Again, the main characters are Black in a different world, but they also have very specific episodes that highlight specific injustices that can spark conversation. Fresh Off the Boat, love that show, is about an Asian American family living in Florida. And so again, some of the episodes are specific about race and things that they've experienced, but it's also just being able to experience a different culture and seeing what someone who doesn't look like you, what their life looks like. Different books. There's Jason Reynolds again, Miles Morales, Spider-Man. Also was a really good movie in case you want to watch that. It's a cartoon. The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas is specifically addresses police brutality, and the main character just talks about her experience knowing a youth who what was shot and killed by a police officer, and kind of going through from her point of view what that looks like. Other things, They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. Lots of great resources here. So lots of places you can start. And then this is just our reference page. If anyone was interested in where we got some of the information from, those could also be articles and things for parents to, again, start that conversation about how to talk to your kids about race. So thank you so much for joining us again for part 2. Feel free to reach out to either Kelly or me if you have questions. We can make sure to share our email addresses with parents and caregivers when this goes out. So thank you.